this, the first talk in our four-part Spring Museum Without Walls lecture series, continuing every Wednesday night through April with this same virtual format. Before proceeding to tonight's presentation, I want to thank our MWOW committee, our Executive Director, Adrian McGraw, and Community Board Member, Dr. Rachel Teasdale. We are also extremely appreciative of all our speakers who are donating their time, talents, and knowledge to the furtherance of teaching and learning about science in our region and beyond. And we do acknowledge and are mindful that CSU Chico stands on lands that were originally occupied by the first people of this area, the Mechoopda, and we recognize their distinctive spiritual relationship with this land and the waters that run through campus. We are humbled that our campus resides on sacred lands that once sustained the Mechoopda people for centuries. Tonight, I am very pleased to introduce to you Mr. Eddy Teasdale, a repeat speaker with MWOW, who brought us important information in a past presentation over a decade and a half ago. His topic then was water pollution in our region. Our theme this spring is water, every drop. Tonight, he will share with us important information about water sustainability in our region, focusing on SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which will change the way water is supplied and accounted for in the future. Mr. Teasdale, a hydrogeologist, has worked primarily in water resources, focusing on groundwater investigations, management, recharge, groundwater banking, water supply infrastructure, improvement planning, and project efforts for over 25 years. We are privileged to have him share his extensive experience in this field. As before, we will have time for questions at the end of his presentation, and we ask you to share your questions in the chat format. Eddy Teasdale.
Great, thanks, Marcia. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here, so this will be the most difficult part of the presentation. So can folks kind of see my screen? Just a nod or a yes? Great, thanks very much. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit today about the California Groundwater, or California Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. But before I kind of dive into that, I thought it would be important to perhaps sort of present some sort of just historical tidbits on kind of groundwater use in California to kind of set the stage and sort of cover some general terms and sort of methodologies. But I promise I will get into sort of the SGMA Act in about 15 minutes. So just some general facts or tidbits on sort of water use in California. I think I've got 9 up on the screen. There's probably about 999 I could add, but just something to kind of set the stage on what we're going to talk about. So looking at sort of box number 1, you know, as the climate sort of gets drier, reservoir levels, so surface water levels are obviously going to decrease, and you see that now in drought periods. So the demand for groundwater is only going to increase. Okay, that's sort of one item that's, you know, I think it's kind of important. You know, California uses more water than any other state. That's groundwater and surface water. More water is used each day in California for irrigation than any other water category. So there's different categories we'll talk about a little bit later. A good item is that California ranks first in U.S. for agricultural production, but as you can imagine, to produce that agriculture, you need water. So that kind of ties back to, you know, element number 2 or item number 2. Specific to groundwater, you know, unlike surface water, which you sort of can visualize at the surface, you can see the reservoirs, you can see the streams, you can see the rivers flowing. You know, groundwater is kind of out of sight, out of mind, right? So because it's underground. So sometimes it's not really, obviously not as understood as surface water, but it's really not sort of on the forefront of folks' minds because it's below ground, out of sight, out of mind. Let's talk a little bit about water usage in California. So for right now, groundwater accounts for about 40% of the supply in California. And then as things get drier, it can actually bump up to about 60%. This is another item. I was kind of surprised that item number 7 here is pumping is obviously required to bring this groundwater to the surface, right, through pumps, and so which accounts for about 5% of the state's total energy use. So now it's not only we've got the water demand, now we're using energy to get the water to the surface. Element number 8, I mentioned this earlier, but oversight of groundwater use has been very minimal in California. In fact, we were the last Western state to actually have any kind of legislative action implemented to manage groundwater. So that's kind of surprising. And then just to kind of bring it home, in Chico, the city of Chico anyway, all our supply is provided through wells, and it's equates to about 16 million gallons per day for groundwater use. As I kind of go through this presentation, one thing I always want folks to kind of keep in mind is, as we use these resources, if you kind of think of this as sort of your bank statement, or maybe your bank account, ideally you're only going to spend as much money as that you have in your bank account, right? And ideally you have a bit of savings too, and you don't really want to tap into that savings unless you have to. So you'll see this kind of pop up throughout the presentation. So kind of continuing the conversation, we know that obviously water is precious. I'm kind of biased. I think groundwater is really more important than surface water. I'll say that on the record. But another sort of element to think about, and this is looking at slide 3 here, is, California has been hot and dry for the past 20 years. So the top graphic really is looking at precipitation from about 1950 through 2020. And it might not be obvious, but essentially anything that's sort of below this 0 line shows you that precipitation has been above average since 1950-ish. And anything below the 0 line in the negative sort of area shows you that the precipitation has been below average. So, I don't think it really takes a rocket scientist to sort of even just eyeballing this. You can kind of see generally since at least the 1950s, water levels, precipitation has been below average. And then kind of, related in a way is now we're going to look at the bottom graph, we're looking at temperature. So again, going back to the 50s, kind of looking at how temperature has sort of changed or deviated above or below the average or from the average. You can kind of see that, okay, from the 50s to maybe the 90s, it was maybe perhaps balanced a little bit, although I still see it being a little hotter than the average. Below the average. But then as you get into the 90s, you can sort of see this sort of these purple bars. So what that's showing you is obviously since about 1990, 2000, it's been the average temperatures in California have been above average. So you kind of look at these two sort of elements and you can kind of think, well, we could be in a bit of trouble here if the climate's getting drier, there's less precipitation, we're using a lot of groundwater, what are we going to do about it? And then, of course, you throw in every once in a while, we get these droughts that come through. So since about the 1970s, there's been at least 5 major droughts that have kind of popped up. Some are saying we're in another one now. So you can kind of see the cards are kind of stacked against us a little bit if we're not really careful with this resource. So let's talk a little bit about groundwater in California. So again, we're looking at water below the ground, and generally this water is sort of stored in these basins. So typically, at least in the sort of the Central Valley of California, these basins are generally alluvial basins, and they're kind of pseudo-defined, generally based on trying to sort of understand the sort of the lateral boundaries, the vertical boundaries. And then within those subbasins, some think of them as maybe a bathtub. Think of it as a bathtub. You've got a bathtub, and then within the bathtub, you've got these other dividers within that bathtub. So you could have these subbasins that are sort of within a basin, right? So when you kind of map all these out in California, there's about 515 of these basins and subbasins. And then they're all, essentially storing groundwater in these subbasins. Another little tidbit. So if you look at sort of the storage capacity of these groundwater basins, so how much water, is actually stored in these groundwater subbasins, is about 850 million to 1.3 billion acre feet. So that might not mean much to folks, but essentially in California, rule of thumb is we're using about 16 million acre feet a year. Okay, so that kind of gives you a sense that we do have a lot of water in storage, and that's being added to in certain specific areas. So now let's just kind of compare that to surface storage. So in California right now, if you added up all the reservoirs, there's about 50 million acre feet of storage. So the capacity for these basins and subbasins to store this water, it's about 10 times that of the surface water storage. So there's a lot of storage potential down there, or potentially a lot of stored water down there. So let's sort of dive in a little bit deeper here, and now let's start looking at these subbasins. What makes up these subbasins? So this is sort of a conceptual cross section looking through a potential subbasin. So I'll just kind of point out a couple of sort of obvious things on the screen here. So we've got the unsaturated zone, right? So rain sort of falls from the sky, down onto the ground, and then perhaps some of it's taken up by the roots to help support the trees. But ideally, some of that's going to migrate through this unsaturated soil zone, or vadose zone, some folks call it, and then it's going to migrate down, and then it's either going to go into the aquifer essentially. So then there's different types of aquifers, but just think of these aquifers again as sort of a subsurface component that can sort of store this water. And then as we know, because of use of the demand, I guess in California, we've got these wells, and this is sort of an example, schematic of a well that taps in to this aquifer, and then it's sort of perforated in a certain zone, but they're going to pump that water out and then, utilize it for irrigation or drinking water. And then keep in mind that some of this water, the groundwater, is going to migrate laterally, and it could, in some cases, like the Sacramento River, it could discharge into the creeks, streams, rivers. So there's a lot of sort of components, but you've got sort of a surface water component, which again, I'm looking at as surface water feature, stream, river, creek, storage reservoir. And then you've got the groundwater system, which really is what I'm considering everything sort of below the subsurface. So let's dive a little bit more into this and sort of look at, where is this groundwater sort of stored? And so again, we're just sort of zooming in to that previous figure now, but we're looking at, again, here's the unsaturated zone. So again, in this case, I'm referencing it as applied water. So it could be recharge, it could be irrigation, you're watering your lawn, whatever it is. That water is applied, and it's going to migrate through the unsaturated zone, and then it's actually going to end up in the aquifer. And there's different types of aquifers. There's sort of alluvial aquifers, so they're made up of unconsolidated sediments, gravels, sands, clays, and then in some cases there's sort of hard rock aquifers, so they're more made up of sort of volcanics, sort of fractured rock systems. Generally, sort of in our neck of the woods, they're considered alluvial aquifers. As you kind of migrate up into the foothills, you start getting into sort of bedrock aquifers. So it's more sort of consolidated rock that kind of provides the use of the supply. The alluvial aquifers are much more prolific because there's a lot more pore space for that water to sort of be stored, versus, as you could imagine, if you kind of go up into the foothills and as you start getting into sort of solid rock, there is storage within that system, but it's stored mostly in the fractures of the rock, so it's not as prolific. You might be able to sort of install a well in an alluvial aquifer and pump that well, and you could take out 3,000-4,000 gallons per minute, but then you go into a bedrock aquifer, you might be able to pump 1 to 20 gallons per minute. So again, not as prolific, but that's just the nature of sort of that's Mother Nature, I guess. So just talking a little bit about wells, because again, we all see them as we kind of drive through the valley. You might not know what you're looking at, but if you kind of look out in these fields and you see these sort of R2D2 looking, things out in the fields, those are generally wells of some sort. So these wells, typically there's different construction and different diameters and different depths, but the principle is the same. You have a hole in the ground that's sort of screened across certain lithologic zones, generally sands or gravels, and then there's a pump in that hole essentially, and sucks the water out. So again, this is just sort of a closed up or zoomed in version of perhaps what the well might look like, in the subsurface. So you've got the well screen, here's sort of the aquifer, and then again, the pump is going to take that water and suck it out of the aquifer and then, apply it, somewhere on the ground. So going back to supply in California, I mentioned in the previous slide, it's a very, very important resource. Looking at, a couple of statistics, currently groundwater use in California is, accounts for about 40% of the total use, which equates to about 16 million acre feet a year. I mentioned earlier, as it kind of gets drier or you sort of entering the drought conditions, obviously the demand is going to go up more. Just to kind of give you a visual of, hey, Eddie, what is an acre foot? If you imagine a football field that had about a foot of water on top of it, that's about roughly about, 325,000 gallons. That's about an acre foot. So kind of putting that into perspective, in California, generally, we're using about 40 to 50 million acre feet a year. And it's a combination, right, of surface water, groundwater, and so that the graphic that's sort of in the center of this slide sort of shows you sort of the relative amounts of water in specific regions. So the sort of the lighter green is sort of the total water use, but then the darker is sort of the use that's utilized by groundwater. And so it maybe not as obvious, but you can kind of see in these this sort of Central Valley and San Joaquin Valley, where there's been a lot of historical overuse of groundwater. They're using, in a lot of cases, a lot more groundwater than surface water compared to perhaps sort of in the Sacramento River. And then as you get up into the North Coast, obviously there's more surface water available, so they're not using groundwater as much. I'll kind of skip through this. Just some general statistics, when we're looking at sort of water use, who's using it in California. So really there's sort of three real sort of user groups that they kind of lump who are the users are, and it's the environment. So in a lot of cases, there's required sort of in-stream demands to support fish, wetlands. And so that actually accounts, for a lot of water. So in this example, in sort of in a wet year, about 62% of the total water use in California is sort of given to the environment. And then you start looking at what else is sort of being utilized. So, here in this example, 29% in a sort of a wet year, but as you enter a dry year, when surface water is not available, it jumps up to 60% is related to agriculture. So again, really important to our economy. And urban usage, for the city of Chico, it's not much. I mean, you'll be surprised, but it's really not a lot, but, varies from 8 to 10% of the total water demand or usage in the state. So you're probably asking, Eddie, when are you going to get into Sigma? So we'll talk a little bit about right now. So what happened was, the state started to realize, we're using a lot of water. It's a precious resource. We see, these changes in climate. Do you think it's about time we started maybe perhaps managing groundwater in California, which again has not been done until very recently? So the figure on the left just sort of gives you sort of a similar screen capture of what I showed on the previous slide, again, to give you a sense of, who's using the water and where and the amounts. And then the other graphic on the right sort of tries to depict sort of specific areas where there is some voluntary groundwater management activities in place. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So there is some, again, it's voluntary groundwater management activities in place, but nothing has been enforced till recently. So anyway, the state started looking at this and they said, well, something's just not right here. We've got to figure out, well, what are we going to do? So they started kind of looking through some historical records, and you know, there's some obvious signs we're headed for trouble if we don't do something soon. So this next slide on slide 11, we're looking at sort of two graphics, and you'll see a lot of red on the graphic on the left. And what this is depicting is the change in groundwater levels from 2011 to 2015. There's about 4,000 wells on that map on your left. So now let's kind of dive into that a little bit more. And the graphic on your right, you know, of the 400 or so wells that are essentially in red in this area, 120 of those wells, or 119 of those wells, have shown a groundwater decline of over 100 feet in 4 years, right? So it's a bit of a challenge, because, you know, there's obviously something going on here that, you know, the in doesn't equal the out, right? So there's less water coming in than folks are taking out. And then there's some different statistics. So again, you can kind of see, you know, here's almost 40% of the wells showed a decrease between 10 and 50 feet, which is not a good thing. And, you know, you'll see, I mean, there's some areas, not many, but, you know, here in this case, it's what, 2%, call it 3%, saw groundwater levels go up since 2011 to 2015, which is kind of what you'd like to see, or at least see no change, but that wasn't the case. So they also started thinking, well, if groundwater levels are dropping, then, you know, we're also seeing a reduction in groundwater storage. So if you think of groundwater storage as your savings account, you're just sort of spending more money and you're sort of depleting that savings account, right? So now you're losing that storage, which you hopefully would have sort of for future generations. So that's going away. So they're thinking, man, this is going to get expensive. And also what happens is, as groundwater levels decrease, now what you're having to do is you're having to lift that water from a lower elevation to pump it up to the surface, because, you know, cities still need water. So as an example, in 2011, the city of Fresno spent about $9 million in electricity costs just to pump water up to the surface. So if water levels continue to decrease, that cost is just going to go up. That pumping cost is just going to kind of go up more and more and more. And then there's a couple of graphics here. We'll just sort of focus in on the one on the right. And what we're looking at here is this is sort of change in storage since about 1962. So, you know, even if you know nothing about sort of graphics, you can kind of see that this is not really the trend you want to see. You know, this red line here, I mean, it's just showing you just starting to see a slow decrease, or actually a rapid decrease in groundwater storage. So it's a problem. So what else is going on? So in certain parts of California, we're seeing subsidence occur. So again, this graphic on the left sort of shows you subsidence. So that's where what we're seeing is the ground surface elevation is essentially subsiding. So it's dropping, and that's actually related to pumping of groundwater. And I'll show you a graphic in a second that kind of relates those two. So this is some INSAR data that was done in the San Joaquin Valley, so just sort of in the Fresno area. And you can see from 2007 to 2011, the surface elevation dropped in some cases by, this is what, 43 inches. So, you know, almost 4 feet. And that's from 2007 to 2011. Again, because of groundwater extraction. This photo that I'm kind of circling here with my mouse, this is along the California Aqueduct. So now, because of subsidence, there's areas along the aqueduct where they're actually, the concrete collapses, because just below that surface of the concrete has obviously sunken because of pumping. And in some cases in the aqueduct, which is a gravity-driven system, they're having to actually pump water over these areas, these low areas, because of these subsided areas. And then the graphic on your right, this is a sort of a very famous photo, Mike Poland. But in 1925, the surface elevation was sort of where this mark is. 1977, this is when the photo was taken. This is where the surface elevation is. So this decrease is a result of groundwater extraction. And then a similar photo was taken, well, a more recent photo was taken. So now we're looking at, subsidence through from 2016 to 1998 to 2016. So, I don't know, we'll call that 6 feet, over that period of time. So it's not a good thing. So what else is going on with groundwater? So just mentioning the subsidence idea. So if you look at this is a graphic where the orange line that you can kind of see, I'm kind of outlining with my cursor here, or following with my cursor. That is surface elevation, right? So just think of it, as a road, or, just think of it as sort of a road elevation. And then these other lines that we see, these are actually water level changes because of a result of pumping. So what you can see is as water levels drop in certain areas, right, the land surface will actually decrease as well. And then sometimes it'll spring back. So this is sort of, it's almost like the surface is breathing. So, if there's, a little bit of give, the surface will drop. And then if there's not too much give, the surface will actually come back. But then it's actually what actually can happen at some point, where you start to, you start picking that trend. Well, yeah, we see a decrease and then it pops back up. But then if you get these large decreases, it'll never, the land surface will never recover back to the original elevation. So in this later example, you can see there's been a big decrease in groundwater levels drop, then that surface elevation drops even more. And so again, you're never going to get this displacement so much, it's never going to get back up to sort of the original sort of elevation. So if this was a road, it's going to have to be redone. An aqueduct, it's going to have to be redone. So there's big damage issues. So what else is going on? So I mentioned earlier about sort of, groundwater usage and surface water usage. So the graphic on the left sort of shows you, again, we've got that cross section of our aquifer system. So, as water falls at the surface, it migrates down into the aquifer. And in some cases, it'll actually go into the stream, like the Sacramento River. So then looking at sort of, the same insert, but maybe looking at item B, now you put in a well to capture some of this water. Nothing wrong with that. So now you're pumping this well, which is okay. You're stopping some of the water that maybe migrates from sort of up gradient towards the surface water feature. Which some folks would argue that's not fair, but it happens. But eventually, what happens if you kind of go down to slide D, or this insert D? Now what happens? You start sucking water or extracting water not only from the aquifer, but you're pulling it from the surface water body. So you can imagine what's going to happen eventually if you keep continuing to do this. Your streams are going to go dry, right? The graphic sort of on the right, top right, this is sort of an example where, up until about 1980 in this particular area, groundwater was feeding the surface water feature. So it was a gaining stream. So groundwater is contributing to the stream. But since about 1990, you're actually pumping groundwater, and you're also, that groundwater now is taking, it's sort of hydraulically connected to the surface water body. So you're drying out that surface water body. Not a good thing. Does it get any worse, Eddie? It does. So we'll keep going. So now we'll talk a little about seawater intrusion. So in this example, we've got, a coastal environment. So we know we've got the ocean. We know the ocean, at least the saline part does sort of, it is hydraulically connected to an aquifer, but you ideally you're pumping fresh water, not the salt water. But in this example, if you continue to extract, eventually, just like the surface water connections, you could potentially start sucking in salty or salt water into your freshwater aquifer system. So the figure sort of on the right kind of shows that, where this particular landowner has obviously irrigated for a long time, and eventually you've got seawater, you got seawater actually migrating into the well that now is being put onto the plants, which will kill the plants. So that's not a good sort of resource, or not a good resource. It's not a good idea. So here's sort of a quick cartoon where this is sort of down in the Monterey area. So in 1944, they kind of mapped out this poor water quality in this general area that's sort of highlighted in blue. And then fast forward to 2011, again, because you had this additional pumping in sort of the Salinas area, essentially you sucked that poor water quality now back into this sort of subsurface land system, or the subsurface aquifer system. That's not a good thing. So you've essentially contaminated the aquifer. Speaking of contamination, you start looking at, obviously the water quality impacts from sucking in the seawater, but also because of, the nature of pesticides, herbicides, feedlots, septic systems. There's been in certain areas, and this is again picking on Fresno a little bit, there's been a big uptick, I guess, if you will, in on contaminants being detected in groundwater. So as an example, this is sort of looking at nitrates. So nitrates are common in, fertilizers, septic systems, feedlots, and it's a good, indicator of the quality of the health of the water you're kind of drinking. But you can see, and it's quite obvious from 1975, 1980, there's been an upward trajectory of poor water quality. So again, that's something that was concerning to sort of the decision makers at the state. So in 2014, they're like, man, we really got to do something here. So how are we going to make this work? So keep it in mind, really, until SGMA was enacted, California had no sort of state groundwater regulations at all. They were all, for the most part, voluntary. And yes, there were some rules and regulations, and it was kind of tied to grants and those kind of things. But as you all know, if there's not any enforcement, it really can be hard to sort of implement any kind of management strategies. So in 2014, the legislature kind of got together and they said, well, we really got to do something with this. So they sort of drafted the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And we'll walk through some of the requirements of that act here in a second. And it became effective in 2015. And so with that in mind, the idea is with this act, there are requirements now in place that basins and subbasins have to become sustainable, right? And sustainable is sort of a qualitative statement, but there's some requirements that are going to be enforced by the state. And so that's sort of the premise of SGMA. So I mentioned it was sort of enacted in 2014, but implementation started in 2015. And what it does is there's, of the 515 subbasins in California, about 100 of them have had some significant issues. We'll talk a little bit about those in a second. Issues with maybe water quality, groundwater levels, water quality, those subsidence. So they sort of identified these 100 subbasins, and they figured, hey, you guys, you need to come up with a management strategy to fix this. So one thing that I think SGMA did well was they really put it back on the locals to take an attempt at trying to fix the problem. And they provided the resources essentially through grants to help the locals sort of start to develop these plans that are going to be required. But there's a backstop. So if the state, if you cannot follow through and develop these plans in a sort of an efficient manner with a certain timeline, the state will step in and take over. And so, there are some basins down in Southern California that are essentially adjudicated. So the courts kind of manage their basins for them. But, again, the purpose or the premise of SGMA was we want the locals to kind of take control. So they identified these sort of problem subbasins by looking at a couple of metrics. So they said, well, if you're in a basin that sort of has a large population, that's increasing in growth, if you're using a lot of wells, if it's in irrigated areas. So they kind of ranked the basins based on this priority mix matrix, if you will. And they've kind of developed them into high priority, medium priority, and actually critically overdrafted. And so some of these basins, you can kind of see them in red. These basins were in big trouble. And so they were sort of put on a fast track. So they had to sort of develop their Sigma processes a little quicker than some of these low priority or these medium and high priority basins. So the good news for us is most of the subbasins sort of in our neck of the woods are high priority or medium priority or even low priority in some cases. So we weren't required to sort of fast track our plans as compared to some of these other subbasins. Quickly go through this slide, but again, I just want to sort of emphasize that when this Sigma Act was sort of implemented, that it really is sort of focused in on the local agencies, and obviously taking input from working with the public to sort of develop these plans. They really want it to be a locally derived plan. That's been pretty important. So let's talk a little bit about the phases. So I mentioned, it was sort of enacted in 2014, or enacted in 2014, implemented in 2015. So they developed these sort of phases on what needs to happen. So phase one, they said you got to form these groundwater sustainability agencies. So these local agencies that are going to be sort of responsible for developing these plans that are required. That was sort of phase one. And so that happened in about 2017. We've kind of moved on. Phase two is sort of, you need to develop these plans, these groundwater sustainability plans. So that's kind of happening now in the state. And then phase three is obviously they're going to have to review these plans, and they being DWR, Department of Water Resources, are going to have to review these plans. And then obviously, it's not just going to stop at the plan. There's going to be reporting that's going to be required to see how you're working towards meeting your sustainability goals. So this sort of calendar or this schedule kind of lays out what I just talked about. So, 2014, 2015, the legislation was enacted. 2017, the GSAs were formed, and now we're in this process. In our case, for most of the subbasins in our area, 2022 is when we have to have these plans developed. Again, with Sigma, it's been really important. They want the locals to provide input, and they're actually the plans that are being developed. There's specific requirements where they have to do public engagement, public outreach, and those kind of things. So let's talk a little bit about sustainability. It's more of a qualitative statement, right? Because it's like, well, what would be a typical sustainability goal? Well, we want water, we want the resources in our aquifer to be available for all beneficial users. Well, that's a great sort of qualitative statement, but how do you quantify that? And that's kind of always been a challenge up until sort of Sigma was sort of enacted. So we've got the goal, which is we want to be sustainable. We can sort of qualify that, in any way we really need to. We've got the regulations to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Plan, which is going to force us to develop these groundwater sustainability plans. And then again, what is unsustainable? So what they've decided is they've sort of developed in the legislation the idea of these undesirable results. Okay, so they've developed these sustainability indicators, and these indicators are going to give you an understanding of the health of the aquifer system, and we'll talk about these indicators here in a second. So, kind of giving it some sort of analogy, with Sigma. So, because there's been a lot of terms that kind of get thrown around. So, what we try to do here is sort of relate the Sigma terms to sort of a health analogy. So as an example, a sustainability goal would be what in the health world? Stay healthy and fit, okay? Sustainability indicators, those could be, for us, it could be weight, blood pressure, how many miles you can run, those kind of things. So it gives you sort of an indicator of the overall health of your body. And again, you can do something similar with sort of an aquifer, groundwater aquifer system, or an aquifer system. And then they've developed these objectives and thresholds, and we'll talk a little about those in a second. So the objectives are the ideal state. So, you kind of put this in sort of in the health analogy term. It's like, well, your doctor's happy with your weight, your blood pressure. He's not going to, give you too much grief when you go to see him. But then if you start looking at these minimum thresholds, that might be, well, like, well, Eddie, you need to lose a little weight there, man. And so that could be sort of a minimum threshold. And then they've also even taken it a step further where they've developed these undesirable results. So, Ed, it's okay to be a little overweight, but if you start being, coming up to be 400 pounds, you're going to have some problems and you need to fix it. So again, just kind of giving you an analogy between sort of the sigma terms and the health, the overall fitness of your health or your body. So going back to these indicators, there's 6 of them. Sometimes they call them the 6 deadly sins. And it kind of aligns with what I sort of presented earlier. So what they've identified is they said, okay, if you have chronic lowering of groundwater levels, that's not a good thing. You've got a reduction in groundwater storage. Okay, that's not a good thing. Seawater intrusion, obviously that's not a good thing. You've got the degraded water quality. Well, we all, I think, can agree that that's not good. Land subsidence, I mentioned that previously. We don't want to induce additional land subsidence. And then we don't want to start, obviously depleting our streams. So these are the sort of 6 indicators. They're not, they don't all apply in every subbasin, but in some subbasins they do. As an example, we don't have a lot of subsidence that have been in Butte County. We don't have a big issue with seawater intrusion. So again, some of these 6 deadly sins don't apply to every subbasin. But the idea is, with these 6 sort of sustainability indicators, we're going to set up these measurable objectives and minimum thresholds for each of the 6 deadly sins. So again, groundwater levels seems to be an easy sort of concept for folks to understand. So they're going to set these measurable objectives. So ideally, where do we want groundwater levels to be? That would be the measurable objective. And then the threshold will be like, we don't want the water levels going below this level. So we're going to have to set these for each of these 6 indicators. And the idea is, this is sort of looking at, I can't see my slide number here, but the idea is that, as an example, let's say you've got groundwater levels kind of bouncing around, through time, and we've sort of established these measurable objectives and measurable thresholds. Really what we want to do as we kind of move towards our goal, which in our case is going to be 2042, we want to try to get our water levels, in this example, as close as we can to the measurable objective or the ideal state. We don't want to actually dip down below the measurable threshold. So again, this is just utilizing water levels as a proxy, but it's sort of applicable for all of the indicators. Something that else is required as part of the SGMA legislation is to develop a groundwater, or actually it's a water budget. So, within these plans that have to be developed, you have to look at, what's coming into the system, right? And then what's going out of the system. So as an example, precipitation is going into the system, and an example of groundwater extraction would be taking water out of the system. So kind of just bringing it back to the the bank statement analogy. We want to make sure that our water balance our water is balanced, just like we want to make sure that our bank account is balanced, which is not the case today. And there's some other requirements in, as we develop these plans, these groundwater sustainability plans, before we can really understand the water balance, we've got to really understand sort of what's going on sort of in this specific subbasin. So we need to really understand, where are the rivers, where are the wildlife refuges, where are the reservoirs, who's using water, where is it being used? And then also we need to kind of get a better understanding of how much water is being extracted out of the system. So there's some requirements within the SGMA legislation to sort of include some of these elements within these groundwater sustainability plans. Something else that's required, probably seems quite obvious, is that we need to understand that this is sort of a map that shows sort of locations of wells. In this case, it's in Tehama County, but we want to sort of understand, how are these wells, how are the water levels changing in these wells through time. So in this example, on all these hydrographs, sort of the y-axis is sort of the groundwater elevation, and then the x-axis is just the time. So you can kind of see through time, yes, water levels bounce up and down, but what does the overall trend look like? So in this example, the overall trend is decreasing through time, not a good thing. So again, these are requirements as part of the developing the plan, but also as we start talking about developing the sustainable management criteria and setting the objectives and thresholds for each of those sort of hydrographs or wells. So what goes into these plans? So there's, there's some guidance docs out there. They're typically made up of, 5 to 7 chapters. And so, in sort of the next slide I'm looking at here, the first sort of chapter or two really describes the basin conditions. So, where's the basin located? Who manages the basin? What's the sort of setting of the basin? What does the geology look like? What does the hydrology look like? What does the land use look like? Who's using water? Where's the water going? So that's sort of, again, sort of lumped into describing the basin conditions. And then you have to have a chapter that sort of looks at defining the basin sustainability. So, how are you going to be? Are you sustainable? The answer is no for most of these subbasins, or they wouldn't be on the list. But how are you going to become sustainable? So you have to have a plan to kind of, implement that, and how you're going to do a better job of managing your groundwater. In a lot of cases, this is sort of factors into this third item here, is you have to develop projects and management actions to become sustainable. So if you're pumping too much water, what are you going to do? Well, you got to stop pumping water or find additional resources. So that sort of gets factors into the plans. And then also you kind of obviously have to develop and adopt the plans. In our case, for a lot of the subbasins in the North State, it's by 2022. So the idea is you take all this technical information and then you can kind of synthesize it down, and then you develop this groundwater sustainability plan that, in theory, is it a friendly, good read? Perhaps for some of us, but you've got everything in one place that documents, everything from land use to who's using water, the water budget, and then the plan to become sustainable. And again, if that's not done, the state's going to come in and do it for you and charge you a lot more money. So I think with that, I'm kind of done. So really the idea, I think, or hopefully the take home message is that, we kind of need to do a better job of kind of balancing our aquifer systems, similar to how we kind of tried to balance our bank account. So I'm not sure what the plan is now. Do we ask questions, or do folks, what do we do here?
That's great, Ed. Thank you so much for your presentation. This is super informative and obviously a very important topic. What we'd like to do now is invite folks to ask Eddy some questions if you have them. And you can type those in the chat, and I will share those questions with Eddy so that he can answer them. And those questions and answers will be recorded. So now would be a great time to type your questions. I see a lot of appreciation in the chat, Ed, so I can tell that folks are really interested, and for obvious reasons, since water is one of those sort of life supporting issues that we need to deal with in California. Sure. While we're waiting for folks to get their questions typed in, one of the questions that I've been thinking about is how much, like I've always heard that water in California has a lot of opportunity for folks who were here first to hold on to their allocations, sort of like a grandfathering in. How much of that is going to play into the way groundwater is managed?
Yeah, so really, and I'm not an water attorney, but when it comes to groundwater, there's no sort of tiered system, no grandfathering in, nothing like that. There is for surface water, but for groundwater, it's like, if your neighbor has a well that they put in 1862 and you want to put in a well tomorrow, you can do that. And if that impacts him, then it's up to him to sue you to prove the impact. So there's no sort of groundwater laws that prohibit from anybody using water. So,
well, that example is interesting that you say that, because one person asked, what kind of redress will people have if they have an older well that might be impacted by new users, like potentially an ag well, that are drilled much deeper? How will that redress occur? Right.
So up until SGMA, it was up to, it would be fought out in sort of in the courts. But, one of the things that SGMA requires is looking at these beneficial uses. So who is a beneficial user? A domestic well is a beneficial user. An ag well is a beneficial user. So you've got to make sure that it's balanced in the sense that everybody gets sort of an equal shot at sort of utilizing the resource. So it's going to attempt to manage that really by if you think back to the groundwater level slide, it's going to look at trying to set a measurable objective or a minimum threshold at a level that would be protective of domestic well owners. That's kind of how it's supposed to work. Yes, so that's a way that it would protect you. But previously you had no recourse. So.
I see.
Yeah.
And this is maybe along the same lines. Another question addresses how new construction of housing weighs into groundwater management plans, whether that's apartments or private homes or what have you.
Yeah, the urban use is really dwarfed compared to the ag use, but in some areas it will impact it. So essentially, when you go through and you develop your water budget or your water balance or your budget, yeah, if you've got a surplus, then there's the ability for growth. But if you've got a deficit, it's going to be really difficult to bring a project on that's taking more water out of an area or a subbasin that's already sort of depleted. So it's going to impact those sort of future developments in certain areas.
I see. Then as far as developing these plans and implementing them, can you say a little bit about how that's funded? Are local water districts having to come up with these plans? How is that funded? It seems like local agencies may not have the money to do that. And then once they are developed, how are they implemented and enforced?
Right. And I want to mention one thing. So in a couple of weeks, Christina Buck's going to come in and she's going to give a presentation really on kind of what Butte County's doing in sort of the Sigma world. So I just wanted to kind of mention that. So there'll be more details sort of on a sort of a local perspective. But yes, going back to your first question. So really one of the things that the state's kind of failed on is, it's obviously enforcement is important, but there's got to be resources there to support it. So for this first phase, well, these phases of developing these plans, there's been resources allocated by the state. So you had to apply for these grants. And for the most part, if you applied for the grants, you got the money. So there's resources available to develop the plans. And they're also making resources available to implement some of the projects that might be required to become sustainable, but to sort of develop the reports, like the annual reports that are required, the 5-year updates that are required. That all has to be funded by the Groundwater Sustainability Agency. So some agencies, they have the resources to kind of fund that on their own. Some agencies have decided, well, we don't have the resources, so they're starting to implement pumping fees in certain areas. The challenge with that is if you don't have a meter on your well, some places are requiring meters on your wells. I think sort of in the North Sac Valley, they're leaning more towards like a Prop 218, sort of a partial tax, property tax kind of thing. So they're on the hook to fund it. So the GSA is on the hook to fund the annual reporting, the 5-year reporting, those kind of things. But the projects, the idea is that the state's going to have money and resources available to help support, implementation. So
I see. And then as far as you talked about subsidence, and a question came up thinking about climate change and sea level rise. Is the subsidence that we're seeing in California going to have an impact on sea level, like in terms of sea level rise? Are the two going to meet so that our land surface is lower now, our water level, our seawater level is higher? Like, is that going to exacerbate the sea level rise issue?
I don't know about sea level rise issue, but I think it's gonna make the potential surface water or the saltwater intrusion issue. It could become, more of a problem. I forgot to mention, so as part of developing the water budget, there's actually 3 water budgets required to be developed for the GSP. You have to have a historic water budget, a current water budget and then a future water budget. And that future water budget has to incorporate climate change. So, but yeah, as far as the, you know, the ocean's going up and sort of, you know, the impacts that might have along with subsidence, it's kind of hard to address that, but yeah. So.
I see. So one person's wondering if you could give us an example of when the state might have to step in with these management plans or implementation of the plans. What does that involve? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I think the way it works is, you know, there's ample opportunities to sort of, you know, get off probation, but what essentially is going to happen is if you know, the plans are due the critically overdrafted plans were due in 2020, and then we've got plans that are due in 2022. So if those plans don't get submitted, there's a process where the state will reach out to that specific entity and say, hey, we need you to either submit your plan, or after they review the plans, maybe there's some issues that they want you to address, and they'll give you a sort of a finite amount of time to address those. And then if you don't, there's this sort of probation process they'll put you on. Then I think if you just, you know, you can't complete that process, then they will step in. And then there's a fee structure that they've developed where they'll come in and they will enforce a fee on domestic well owners, ag well owners. And so that's how they're going to fund that process. And it's going to take, you know, the local control away, and the state will kind of come in. I obviously the program is so new, I don't know of any. Well, they're still reviewing the 2020 plan, so it hasn't happened yet. So
I see. And maybe our last question addresses water use, particularly in the North State, where of course agriculture is important to us. And when we drive around, we see orchards and we also see rice fields. Can you tell us what's the sort of relative water use among different orchards versus rice production?
Yeah, so I can tell you an interesting trend in Butte County, because you do drive up and down sort of the state, and you start seeing a lot of orchards going in, but a lot of those orchards, like a lot of almond orchards now in Butte County, are being replaced by walnuts. So actually the water demand has actually gone down in Butte County over the last 15, 16 years. And so there's going to be growth, but I think, you know, some of that is actually going to decrease the water use because of the agriculture that's being sort of replaced. And also a lot of rice, if rice is converted over, you know, to tree crops, it's actually less water. So that's actually a good thing. So.
Okay, so just to get it straight, you're saying rice uses more water than orchards?
Yes.
I see. Okay. All right. Well, there you have it. And if you weren't hungry before, you might want to have a nutty rice dinner. But we'll thank Eddy one more time for being here, and thank all of you for being here. And Marcia, if you'd like to take us out, that would be great.
Take us out. Well, I was going to say the same thing, Eddy. That was superb. It was so clear and so horrifying, and it does make us glad that something's being done proactively. And yes, this is sort of part one of Sigma. So week after next, Christina Buck will be doing part two, what Sigma means for us locally. And then do come back next week, because we saw a reference to surface water, and Sandrine Matiasek will be sharing with us lots of information about surface water and bioswales. And if you don't know what bioswales are, come and find out next week. Thanks to all of you for coming. Share with your friends. And if you know someone who couldn't make it tonight but is interested, remember these are now all archived on the Gateway Science Museum website. So this will be available in about 2 weeks. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Have a good night.